In the present, the file on Robert L. Looney still ends with a stamp, not a sentence. Thin paper, yellowed at the edges, bears dates and notes, but no conclusion. What is missing is what could not be administered, the waiting. For his family, this news came as a physical object, an envelope from Western Union, opened at a kitchen table. The text was brief, factual, without location, without grave. Robert L. Looney was no longer lost everywhere, yet he had not returned home either. Before the war entered Robert's life, time was something reliable. It did not come suddenly, and did not disappear unexpectedly. It repeated itself. Mornings began with the same sounds, the creaking of the floor when someone got up first, the metallic clink of a cup on the kitchen table, the brief opening of the back door to check the weather. For Robert L. Looney, this repetition was not a lack of variety, but a form of security. Things that behaved the same way could be understood. He grew up in Tennessee, in a family where work was rarely commented on, but always expected. His father, Hassel Looney, was not a man of many words. He spoke when something needed to be said and kept silent when silence sufficed. In the mornings he dressed, checked his watch, put on his hat. These actions were so regular that Robert could have recited them without looking. His mother, Susie, held the house together, not through strictness, but through attention. She knew where things were, and immediately noticed when something was missing. Order was not a principle for her, but a form of care. Robert was not a child who stood at the center. He observed. He listened. When adults spoke, he remembered tone and pauses. He learned early that information lay not only in words, but also in what was not said. This ability accompanied him, without him being able to name it. Even as a teenager, he was drawn to technical things. He was especially fascinated by radios. They did not just stand there and function. They had to be adjusted, checked, and understood. In the evenings, he often sat at a simple device that stood on a shelf. The light was dim, the air cool. He put on the headphones, slowly turned the dial, and listened to the static. He was not specifically searching for voices. He listened for changes. A slight wavering in tone, a sudden break, the reappearance of a signal. These moments demanded patience. Often nothing happened for a long time. Robert remained sitting anyway. When his mother stopped at the door and asked if he was hearing anything interesting, he usually answered calmly, "Not yet." He did not say it disappointedly. For him, waiting was part of the activity. A signal that did not come was just as much information as one that could be clearly heard. He began making small notes. Frequencies, times, brief observations. He wrote with pencil, neatly, without flourishes. This notebook became a constant companion. After school, Robert worked in areas related to electricity and radio. It was not work that drew attention. Devices were repaired, lines checked, contacts cleaned. Errors rarely announced themselves loudly. They showed themselves in small deviations that one only noticed if one remained attentive. This work suited him. It demanded precision, not self-presentation. As the political situation changed and the war drew closer, this change initially penetrated the house only through the radio. Names of distant places were mentioned more frequently. Voices sounded more serious. Nevertheless, Robert's daily routine initially remained the same. He went to work, returned in the evening, sat down at the table and wrote. Sometimes at night, he still listened to foreign stations, far away, barely comprehensible. These voices seemed strangely close and at the same time unreachable. They reminded him that connection was possible, even over great distances. The decision to enlist with the Army Air Forces came without drama. There was no big conversation, no ceremonial words. Robert recognized that his skills were needed. For him, this was not a call to adventure, but a logical consequence. Work was there, so it had to be done. His family took the news calmly. Susie asked when he had to leave. Hassel nodded and said only, "Do your work properly." No more was said. In training, it quickly became clear that Robert's attitude was in demand. Radio operators had to be reliable. They had to follow checklists, check equipment before each mission, transmit messages exactly. It was not about being creative, but about being correct. Robert did not stand out through special initiative, but through consistency. He rarely made mistakes. When he did, he corrected them quietly. The daily donning of the headset became a fixed ritual, He put it on, tightened the straps, checked the fit. Then he tested the connection. Only after that did he open his notebook. The frequency lists were kept clean, the entries clear. This notebook was not a personal diary for him, but a tool. It helped him keep track. In the evenings, he wrote letters home. They were short, factual, without great emotions. He mentioned the weather, the cold at altitude, the changed sounds of the engines. Once, he wrote that the nights were colder than one would expect. Another time, he mentioned that radio connections behaved differently when the air became thinner. He avoided speaking about danger, not out of repression, but because there was nothing concrete to report. In one of these letters, he wrote the sentence that would later be quoted often: "I will listen, not shoot." For Robert, this sentence was not a reassuring formula. It simply described his task. Listening meant distance from direct combat. It meant being part of a chain that functioned as long as everyone fulfilled their role. For his family, this sentence had weight. Susie read it several times. Listening sounded safer than fighting. It sounded like work, not danger. She folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others. The box in which she kept these letters was still light then. It fit comfortably on a shelf. Robert himself thought clearly about the time after the war. He spoke of working again in the civilian sector, perhaps with better training, with more modern technology. He expected no fundamental change in his life. The war was an interruption for him, not a redefinition. Routine was supposed to return. However, there was one concrete concern that accompanied him. He knew how sensitive machines could become when conditions changed. Engines at high altitude, especially, occupied his thoughts. He had learned to pay attention to the smallest changes. Once, he said quietly to a comrade, "If something fails, there's little time." It was not a dramatic statement. It was an observation. In quiet moments, when he listened to foreign stations at night, he felt a simple joy. Voices, slightly distorted, but clearly human. He wrote down the frequency, closed the notebook, and set the headset aside. These small moments reminded him why he liked this work. The day before his transfer, he wrote another letter home. He mentioned that he always carried his notebook with him. It helped him stay calm. At the end he wrote, "I will come back when the work is done." For him, this was a factual sentence. He had no reason to give it more meaning. When Robert left the house, little remained behind. A radio on the shelf, a few pieces of clothing, the box with letters. None of it seemed final. Everything looked as if it would soon be used again. Routine was interrupted, but not ended. And that was exactly how the people who left him behind felt, as a pause, not as a farewell. Entry into active service changed Robert's life less through new activities than through new consequences. The work itself remained the same. Listen, check, note, report. But now every routine action carried more weight than could be seen. The environment forgave no inaccuracy, and it offered no second chance. Chabua Airfield in Assam was not a place that made an impression. The runways lay low, surrounded by wet ground and dense vegetation. In the mornings, fog lay over the field, not dramatically, but persistently. It dissolved slowly, as if to show that it could not be forced. For the crews of the Air Transport Command, Chabua was not the starting point of an adventure, but a junction. Here began a route that could only be mastered through repetition. Robert L. Looney came early to the aircraft. He always did. He did not like checking things under time pressure. The C-87 Liberator Express stood motionless, its fuselage dull, traces of previous missions still visible. He boarded, moved through the narrow interior, placed his notebook in the same spot as always. The pencil lay within reach. Small things had to be right so that big things did not go awry. The crew consisted of 6 men. Captain Bobby A. Cook was the pilot. He spoke little, but clearly. His voice hardly changed, whether on the ground or in the air. The co-pilot, First Lieutenant Marvin Siegel, worked through the instruments, always in the same order. He touched each switch with the same care, as if deviation were more dangerous than error. Navigator John P. Falvo had the maps spread out before him, lines drawn, points marked. His fingers followed the routes as if they could smooth the terrain. Technical Sergeant Henry C. Jones listened to the engines, not casually, but with an attention that had developed over years. Master Sergeant Thomas L. McIntosh was aboard as an observer, an additional person in an already fully occupied space. There were no long conversations. The men knew each other through repetition, not through closeness. Everyone knew what the other had to do. That was enough. Robert put on his headset. The leather had become soft from use, the pressure familiar. He tested the connection. A brief click, then a steady background static. He wrote the date and time in his notebook. His handwriting was even, matter of fact. No decoration, no haste. The takeoff proceeded without incident. The aircraft rolled forward. The engines increased their power. The ground disappeared beneath them. Robert felt the vibration through the seat, through the floor, through his body. He knew this feeling. It was part of the work. The flight over the Himalayas, which everyone called only the hump, was not a mission one spoke about. It was a necessity. After the Burma Road was lost, only this route remained. Everything that reached China had to pass through this air corridor. That meant altitude, cold, weather that gave no warning. It also meant that losses were calculated, long before an aircraft took off. During the climb, the world outside the windows changed. Cloud layers lay on top of each other, without clear boundaries. The light became more diffuse. The air became thinner. Robert heard it in the engines, not as a malfunction, but as adaptation. He knew that every meter of altitude meant less margin. The cold crept slowly into the cabin. It settled in the fingers, made metal seem harder. Robert briefly moved his hands without taking off the headset. Ice was always present. It did not form suddenly, but gradually. On wings, on antennas, on everything exposed to the airstream. No one had to mention it. Everyone knew what it meant. Captain Cook said calmly at some point, "We're staying in the window." It was not an order, more a statement. Robert nodded unconsciously. He checked the frequency. The static changed slightly. No clear signal. He noted the time. Position reports were scheduled. They served not for navigation, but for traceability. They told the system that an aircraft existed, that it was moving, that it was still part of the plan. Robert waited for the designated time window. He aligned the equipment, checked the setting again. Radio traffic over the hump was unreliable. Mountains blocked signals. Atmospheric conditions distorted them. Robert knew that silence did not automatically mean danger. Often reports arrived late or were lost entirely. Nevertheless, every missing connection had weight. It was a deviation that had to be noted. He tried again. No answer. Only the steady static, interrupted by brief disturbances. He wrote down the time. He said nothing yet. Too early to assume anything. The C-87 had its reputation. The men knew it. Leaking tanks, sensitive systems, poor icing characteristics. Henry Jones had checked the indicators once more before takeoff and said quietly, "She'll hold if we treat her gently." It was not confidence in the grand sense, more a working assumption. As time went on, the waiting intensified. In the cabin it was loud enough to make conversation difficult, but not loud enough to cover thoughts. Robert did not think about crashing. He thought in processes. If a signal did not come, there were reasons. Mountains, weather, technology. His task was to listen and document, not to interpret. On the ground, clocks continued to run. In China, they waited for the aircraft. In Assam, they looked at lists. Delays were calculated. Only when the time window was exceeded did the entry change. Aircraft overdue, presumed lost. These words were noted matter-of-factly. They described a state, not a process. There was no distress call, no fragmented signal, no final message. For Robert, this meant that if something had happened, it must have happened quickly. Radio could suddenly fail. Antennas could ice over. Electrical systems could fail, or there was no more time to transmit anything. Search possibilities were limited. Clouds lay low. The terrain was inaccessible. Air search meant flying over gray and white, without contrast. A wreck could lie directly below and remain invisible. Ground search was not provided for under wartime conditions. Planning accepted this. For the Air Transport Command, loss was part of the calculation. It was recorded, not explained. The next day, other aircraft took off. Other radio operators put on their headsets, checked their equipment, wrote times in their notebooks. Operations could not falter. In the files, the entry remained brief. Date, Aircraft type, serial number, crew. Status, Robert L. Looney. Went from on mission to missing in action. This did not mean he had been forgotten. It meant that the process was concluded, as far as circumstances permitted. For Robert himself, there is no recorded moment of recognition. No final sentence. No captured gesture. His activity consisted of listening, waiting, noting. Perhaps he just had the pencil in his hand. Perhaps he was still sitting with the headset on when something changed. These details are not documented. What remains is the sequence. A takeoff, a flight, a route over mountains that forgive no errors, an absence of signals, a file that was passed on. The war continued because it had to continue. For the people who knew him, something else began here. Not with an event, but with an absence. An aircraft that did not land, a time that was exceeded, and a routine that suddenly had no continuation, without anyone being able to say why. The news did not come with the disappearance. It came later, in a temporal gap that officially had no significance, but for the family had already changed everything. Between the 9th of April, 1943, and the arrival of the notification, Robert L. Looney existed in a state of suspension. He had not returned, but was also not lost. He was delayed, and being delayed was something one knew, something that could be explained. In Tennessee, daily life initially continued unchanged. Hassel Looney got up at the same time in the morning, dressed, checked the weather before leaving the house. Susie prepared breakfast, cleared away dishes, wiped the table. The radio ran in the background. As always. News was heard, but not counted. The war was present, but not concrete. Robert was somewhere, as he had described in his letters, busy, working, waiting. These days had no clear marker. They were neither hope nor grief. They were filled with habit. Susie expected a letter. Hassel did not expect anything. But he looked at the clock when the postman came. No one spoke about it. The waiting was not yet official. The envelope came one morning. No special date, no holiday. A man from Western Union stood at the door, handed over the paper, said the name correctly, without emphasis. He did not wait. The handover was complete as soon as the envelope changed owner. For him, it was an assignment, not a moment. Susie held the envelope in her hand for a moment before opening it. The paper was smooth, cool. It felt heavier than it should. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had read, folded, filed Robert's letters. The chair stood slightly crooked. She did not straighten it. The text was short. No introduction, no personal salutation. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret. The wording was familiar. She had seen it in newspapers. Missing in action following the loss of an aircraft over the Himalayas. No further details. No location. No indication of search. No time frame. Hassel read the text after Susie handed him the paper. He read slowly. Then he folded the envelope back together, carefully, as if he would have to open it again later. He said nothing. Susie asked quietly, "What does that mean?" It was not a rhetorical question. She wanted to know what was now expected, whether something had to be done. The answer did not come immediately. Not because Hassel did not want to give it, but because it did not exist. Missing was not a state one could categorize. It was not a death one could mourn. It was also not a life one could write to. It was a designation that held responsibility and prevented action. In the following days, the family waited for an addition, for another letter, for a call, for anything that would expand this sentence. Every walk to the front door carried a silent expectation. Every glance at the mailbox had weight, but nothing came. The system had done its part. An Army notification officer was assigned. He did not come personally. Contact consisted of formal letters and a brief phone call. His voice was calm, controlled. He explained that the aircraft was considered lost over the Himalayas, that the terrain made a search impossible, that weather and altitude complicated the circumstances. He spoke of regulations, not of possibilities. Susie listened. She understood the words. But they found no place. Over the Himalayas was not a place she could grasp. It was a term that meant everything and nothing. Mountains, snow, distance. No point on a map that could have been marked. There was no body, no personal object returned, No ring, no piece of cloth, no fragment. Everything that existed of Robert was already there. Letters that now had a different weight. His handwriting, which suddenly seemed concluded, although it should not be. The kitchen table became the center of this new reality. There lay the envelope. There lay the letters. Susie took them out of the box again and again. She ran her finger over the letters, not to find a hidden message, but to create closeness. The letters were proof that Robert had planned to return, that he had spoken of an afterward. One sentence kept recurring. I will listen, not shoot. Back then, it had been reassuring. Now it seemed incomplete. Listening had not protected him. The distance that had been attributed to it no longer existed. The war had made no difference. The official correspondence remained brief. At regular intervals, letters arrived. They confirmed that the status had not changed. No additional information available. This sentence repeated itself. It became its own kind of routine, a promise that promised nothing. For Hassel, the waiting was a silent burden. He spoke hardly about it. When neighbors asked, he said, "He is missing." It was a sentence that ended conversations. Condolences did not fit. Hope sounded wrong. One did not know how to react. Daily life changed in small, barely noticeable things. Susie left Robert's room untouched. Not out of conscious hope, but because every change would have meant a decision. His few personal belongings remained. The radio on the shelf was not used. It was not a prohibition. It was a hesitation. Time began to behave differently. There was no date on which one could have said, "Now it is over." The 9th of April became an open point. Every further letter from the army renewed this state. Neither grief nor expectation could fully unfold. The family knew that others had received clear news. Names in the newspaper, with the addition killed in action. This clarity was missing here. Robert had not fallen, but had also not returned. He remained in an intermediate space that could not be closed. For the military administration, the case was clear. Loss over inaccessible terrain. No recovery possible. Status, missing in action. These categories were necessary. They allowed the war to be organized. For families, they meant standstill. There was no attempt to determine the crash site more precisely. The means were not sufficient. Maps were imprecise. Weather prevented visibility. Ground search was excluded. These explanations sounded logical. They changed nothing. Susie began to reorganize the letters. By date, not by content. It was a way to regain control. Each letter was proof that Robert had existed, that he had planned to return. These plans now stood in the room without answer. Sometimes she spoke aloud to him while she worked. No long conversations, short sentences. "Today it is cold," or "Your brother was here." It was not a conscious action. It was a habit that had crept in. The war continued. New news reached the country. Numbers, places, victories, losses. At some point another letter came. The status remained unchanged. No progress, no regression. Only confirmation. The immediate consequence of the disappearance was not an explosion of feelings. It was a slow shift. Life continued, but askew. Every routine had a gap. Every day carried an uncertainty within it. The kitchen table remained the place where paper weighed more than words, where a single sentence changed everything without explaining anything, and where waiting began, not as a decision, but as a state. Over time, the waiting stopped feeling like a phase. It became a condition, not something that began and ended, but something that expanded and quietly overlaid everything that followed. For the Looney family, the status missing in action did not mean uncertainty in the classical sense, but a permanent incompleteness that permitted no clear approach. After the first months, the tone of correspondence changed. The Army's letters became more formulaic. They contained no new information, but only confirmed that there continued to be no new information. Each letter began differently and ended the same. Robert L. Looney continued to be considered missing. No indication of survivors. No indication of recovery. The Himalayas were no longer explained. They were presupposed. Susie Looney filed these letters carefully, not out of hope, but out of sense of order. Paper did not simply disappear. It got a place. The box with Robert's letters grew. She filed the new letters separately from them. as if they belonged to a different person. Her son's letters were personal. The Army's letters were abstract. They spoke about Robert without knowing him. Looney reacted differently. He read the letters once and spoke hardly about them afterward. He asked no more questions, not because he had none, but because he had grasped that there was no one who could answer them. When acquaintances inquired, he stayed with the same sentence, "He is missing." Over the years, this sentence was spoken more briefly, more routinely. It became part of his vocabulary, not part of a conversation. The absence of a body changed everything, having to do with farewell. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no place where one could have stood to conclude something. The family cemetery in Tennessee had a gap, a space that was designated but remained empty. No stone, no name. Only a piece of earth that was not used. This empty space was visible, even if no one spoke about it. Over time, the surroundings began to adapt. Neighbors stopped asking. New people knew nothing about Robert. His name was mentioned less often, not out of forgetting, but out of caution. One did not know how to speak about it. Every attempt seemed either too early or too late. Susie held on to small habits. On certain days, she took the letters out of the box and read them again. Not all, only some. She had long known the content. It was not about information. It was about closeness. The handwriting was proof that Robert had existed, that he had thought, planned, hoped. Especially the sentences about the time after the war stuck. She read them slowly, sometimes aloud. Then she folded the letters back together. Over the years, the weight of these sentences also changed. At first, they had promised future. Later, they seemed like relics from another life. Robert had spoken of return, of work, of routine. These ideas now stood without present. They no longer fit the time that had continued to run. The war ended. That was a date that could be held on to. For many, it meant return, homecoming, new beginning. For the Loonies, it meant a new kind of waiting. With the end of combat, the explanation for why nothing could happen disappeared. But nothing changed in the situation. Robert remained missing. In 1945, the family received another letter. It stated that Robert L. Looney would be officially declared dead, retroactively, killed in action, administratively. No new find, no new findings. Only a legal adjustment. The state needed closures. Pensions had to be regulated, files closed. For Susie, this letter was heavier than all previous ones. It took something away without giving anything back. The missing status had at least left the possibility open, even if it had become increasingly abstract over the years. The official declaration of death created clarity for the system, not for the family. There was still no place, still no body, only a new word. Hassel said only, now it stands on paper. It was not agreement, not contradiction. It was a statement. The paper changed nothing about what was missing. The years passed. Siblings grew older. Some died. The generation that had known Robert began to disappear. Memories became thinner. Stories shortened. Robert became from a person to a narrative. Not intentionally, but through time. For younger family members, Robert was someone who was missing without ever having been present. An uncle, one spoke about, without knowing him. His absence was structural. It belonged to the family. Like an empty chair that was never cleared away, although no one knew anymore to whom it had originally belonged. The files remained. At regular intervals, they were reviewed. Each review came to the same result. No wreck found, no survivors, no new clues. The Himalayas remained an argument, not a place. Technology developed further. Aircraft became better. Navigation more precise. Satellites began to map the Earth. But the region where Robert's aircraft had disappeared remained difficult to access. Political borders, lacking infrastructure, terrain. The same reasons were cited again, only with different words. Susie died in 1986. She had never learned where her son had remained. In her last years, she spoke rarely about it, not because it had become indifferent to her, but because the waiting found no more expression. It had become part of her, something that no longer had to be explained. Hassel had already died before. He too without answer. The box with the letters passed to other family members. It was opened, examined, closed again. The papers were old, the ink faded, but legible. Robert's handwriting had survived. With each generation, the meaning of the absence shifted. For some, it was personal, painful, concrete. For the next, it was historical, requiring explanation. Questions arose that had not been asked before. Why was there never a search? Why did one know nothing more precise? These questions were not directed against anyone. They were directed against the empty space itself. The long waiting had no dramaturgy. There was no turning point, no climax. It consisted of repetition, of letters without content, of files without movement, of a name without place. And yet it changed lives. Decisions were postponed or never made. Places remained empty. Rituals remained incomplete. The war was over, but one of its consequences remained, quietly, permanently. Robert L. Looney was concluded in the official records. For the family, he was not. He was not present, but also not past. He remained bound to an open point in time. The long waiting was not an active state. It was something that happened while one lived, while one worked, grew old, died. It demanded no action, only endurance. And so decades passed in which nothing happened, and yet everything remained changed. Until at some point someone began to ask, not out of personal loss, but from the feeling that a task had remained unfinished. The case of Robert L. Looney was not reopened because something had changed, but because someone refused to continue accepting the old justifications. For decades, nothing had moved, not out of indifference, but because movement was considered impossible, not recoverable, inaccessible, no realistic prospect. These formulations had become fixed building blocks over time, explanations that no one checked anymore. They stood for a boundary that was no longer questioned. Only many years after the war did this attitude slowly begin to shift, not within the institutions, but outside them. Private researchers, former military personnel, historians without official assignment began to read old lost reports anew, not with the view of the planners of that time, but with the knowledge of later generations. What had previously been considered final now appeared incomplete. Clayton Coulis was one of them. No official investigator. He did not work on behalf of the state, but from a personal conviction. For him, not findable did not mean not present, but not yet located. This distinction was decisive. It shifted responsibility from the past to the present. The first step was not a departure into the field, but a visit to the archive. Coulis began where the war had stopped, with paper, mission logs, loss reports, weather reports, route plans of the Air Transport Command, documents that had lain next to each other for decades without being read together. He compared takeoff times, planned flight altitudes, known weather conditions. He asked no new questions. He asked old questions again, but more systematically. In doing so, he noticed how large the assumed search areas had been. Over the Himalayas was not a coordinate. It was an evasive formula. But even within this region, there were fixed routes, preferred corridors, altitude profiles that were used again and again. The first ferrying group did not fly randomly. It flew along probabilities. Coulis reconstructed these probabilities. He redrew maps, not according to political borders, but according to flight paths. He marked known crash sites of other aircraft, compared them with weather conditions documented on the 9th of April 1943. The work was slow, unspectacular. For weeks, apparently nothing happened. But gradually clues condensed. A central problem of earlier search approaches was the assumption that wrecks had to be visible to be found. This assumption ignored the dynamics of the terrain. Steep slopes, monsoon rains, snowmelt. Metal did not disappear, but it migrated. Wreckage parts could move downslope over years, overgrown by vegetation, covered by debris. What remained invisible from the air could exist on the ground without being recognizable. Coulis did not rely only on maps. He began to speak with people who lived there. Hunters, gatherers, villagers in the remote regions of present-day Arunachal Pradesh. These people had no connection to American lost lists. For them, aircraft parts were not a historical puzzle, but material. Aluminum could be used, resold, reformed. Wrecks had become part of the landscape. These conversations were cautious. Coulis did not appear as a searcher for the fallen, but as someone who asked whether there were places in the mountains where metal lay, whether there were places one avoided, Slowly, clues emerged. Not precise, but recurring. He heard the same descriptions in different places. Aluminum fragments. Steep slopes. No complete fuselages. The transition from the file to the field was not a heroic step. It was laborious. Paths hardly existed. Equipment had to be carried. Each step meant physical exertion. The slopes were unstable. Rain transformed paths into slides. Each ascent required concentration. When the team finally reached an area north of Tezu, the nature of the search changed. It was no longer about discovering something, but about confirming something. The first fragments lay scattered. Deformed aluminum, partially overgrown by plants. No clear lines. No recognizable structure at first glance. Coolers knew that identification required patience. Aircraft leave patterns, even when destroyed. Rivet spacing, material thicknesses, fracture edges. He compared found parts with known specifications of the C-87 Liberator Express. Piece by piece, a picture came together. Not complete, but clear enough. On the 16th of October 2008, it was clear that these were the remains of the C-87 with serial number 41-23791. For the first time since 1943, the aircraft had a location. Not a general region, but a concrete spot in the terrain. Coordinates, altitude, slope angle. The Himalayas were no longer an abstract argument, but a physical space. This determination was not an emotional climax. It was sober. There was no moment of relief, no remains that could be recovered, no personal objects that returned. Only metal, distributed over a slope, marked by decades of movement. The discovery did not immediately change the status. The state reacted cautiously. The data were checked. Photos evaluated, reports read. Finally, it was confirmed that the wreck actually belonged to the missing aircraft. The case was located, but not closed. An official recovery team was not dispatched. The justification was the same as before, only more precisely formulated. The terrain was too unstable, the danger to personnel too high, recovery not justifiable. This decision was not new, but it now had a different sound. It no longer referred to ignorance, but to weighing. For the family, this development meant a shift, not a resolution. For the first time, there was a place that could be named. A point on the map. Something that no longer existed only in files. But this place was not accessible. It could not be visited, not changed. It remained outside reach. The reopening of the case showed above all the limits of earlier methods. Not because they had been wrong, but because they were limited. Technology, politics, war. All these factors had determined what was possible. What was unthinkable in 1943 became thinkable in 2008. But even in 2008, there were limits. Koulis himself later spoke of knowing where the aircraft was, but not where the men had remained. This distinction was crucial. The localization of the wreck answered one question, but left others open. Had the mortal remains migrated downslope? Were they buried under debris? Or had they never existed on the surface? The institutions could not answer these questions without taking risks they did not want to bear. Private initiative had found the location. However, the responsibility for what came next remained with the state, and the state decided not to go further. Thus, the case was reclassified, no longer as lost, but as located. Recovery currently not possible. A more precise formulation, one that acknowledged knowledge without promising action. For the story of Robert L. Looney, this meant a transition. The decades of complete ignorance were over, but the waiting had not dissolved. It had only changed its form. Instead of waiting for news, one now waited for possibility. The reopening of the case was not an act of redemption. It was an act of correction. It showed that the label not findable was always also a statement about the respective moment, about tools, priorities, willingness. And it made clear that duty cannot always be fulfilled in one step. Sometimes it remains fragmented, like the wreck on the slope, recognizable but not fully accessible. The confirmation of the wreck find in October 2008 brought no relief in the usual sense. It brought order, precision, a boundary. For the first time in 65 years, the aircraft with which Robert L. Looney had taken off in April 1943 was no longer just a serial number on a loss list. The C-87 Liberator Express had received a clearly determined location. A steep slope north of Tezu, a specific altitude, geographic coordinates that could be entered on maps. What had been described for decades, with the formulation lost over the Himalayas, was now reduced to a concrete point. And precisely this reduction made visible what continued to be missing. When the documentation from Clayton Kulas and his team was forwarded to the responsible military authorities, no emotional moment began, but a factual process. The documents were not read, they were examined. Photographs of the debris lay next to each other on tables. Aluminum fragments were enlarged, labeled, compared. Experts examined rivet spacing, material thicknesses, characteristic fracture patterns. Old blueprints of the Liberator Express were consulted to classify every detail. The identification of the aircraft did not occur through a single find, but through the convergence of many small correspondences. The result was unequivocal. There was no doubt that the debris belonged to exactly that aircraft that had taken off from Chabua in April 1943 and never arrived in China. The original loss report had been correct. The assumption of a crash had been right. The file had contained no error. It had merely ended where the possibilities of that time ended. With this clarity, however, only one question had been answered. The other remained. In none of the reports were there indications of human remains on the surface of the wreck field. This finding was not evaluated as surprising. On the contrary, in the professional assessments, it was expressly pointed out that the absence of visible remains under the given circumstances should have been expected. The slope where the wreck lay was extremely steep. Debris fields alternated with dense vegetation. Over decades, monsoon rains, snowmelt, and erosion had kept the ground constantly in motion. Metal had migrated downslope, had distributed itself, had disappeared under earth and stones. Organic material had been even more strongly exposed to these forces. In such an environment, nothing remained where it had originally come to rest. This assessment inevitably led to the question of whether recovery was possible. Within the responsible authorities, this question was not treated casually. Scenarios were developed, access possibilities evaluated, risks calculated. Helicopter operations were theoretically examined and just as quickly rejected. There were no safe landing sites. Rappelling personnel would have required a stabilization of the slope that could not be guaranteed. Each step would have carried the risk of rockfall or landslide. A single error could have endangered further lives. At the end stood a decision that was soberly formulated and yet carried weight. Recovery was currently not feasible. This formulation was more precise than earlier justifications. It no longer referred to ignorance, but to weighing. It acknowledged that the location was known, that knowledge existed, but that the price of further action would be too high. The word currently remained deliberately open. It did not mean never, but it also did not mean foreseeable. It shifted responsibility into a future whose conditions remained unclear. For files, this formulation was sufficient. For people, it was hard to bear. When the Looney family was informed about the find, this happened without ceremony. Again, the news came in the form of paper. Again, they were factual sentences. But this time they contained something that had never existed before, a place. No description in pictures, no circumlocution, but numbers that marked a point on Earth, a slope, a region, a place that could be named. A younger family member remembered later how these coordinates stood on the sheet. They seemed precise, almost reassuring. Finally, something solid. Finally, something that was not just an administrative term. And yet nothing could be done with these specifications. One could not travel there. One could place nothing. No flower, no stone, no name. The place existed, but it remained outside human reach. For older relatives, this news was ambivalent. For decades, not knowing had dominated. Now knowledge was there, and yet no action. The loss was no longer everywhere. It was somewhere, but this somewhere was not a place of encounter, not a place of farewell. In the family, people spoke about it, but not in big words. They were short sentences, spoken quietly. Now we know where it is, or now it has a place. But what this place meant remained unspoken. Only one thing was clear, that Robert had remained there. What remained unclear was whether more would ever be possible. A detail that was not recorded in any official file gained special significance during this time. Robert had begun in his last letters to write small numbers in the upper right corner of the pages. Not in all letters, only in the later ones. No one knew exactly why. Perhaps he wanted to keep track. Perhaps he expected that mail could be lost. These numbers ended abruptly. They formed no completed series. For the family, they became a silent sign of something begun that had not been carried through to completion. The location of the wreck did not remain unchanged, even after it had become known. Rain washed away earth. Plants overgrew metal. What had been visible during the first inspection could have disappeared years later. The mountain followed its own processes. It did not react to decisions, files, or schedules. It held what it held and did not give it back voluntarily. For historians, the find represented a confirmation. It showed that private initiative could proceed where institutional boundaries had been reached. For the military administration, it meant a specification. A case was now more precisely described, not newly evaluated. For the Looney family, it was neither victory nor defeat. It was a shift. The central question had changed. For decades it had been, what had happened? Now it was, what might still be possible? This new question remained unanswered. Perhaps one day technical means would exist that would permit safe recovery. Perhaps political conditions would facilitate access. Perhaps someone would decide that the risk had become bearable. Or perhaps none of this would occur. What had been achieved was clarity about the location. What remained open was the return. Robert L. Looney was no longer disappeared in an indefinite space. He was bound to a concrete point in the landscape. But this point was not a grave. In the end, remains an image that does not dissolve. A sheet of paper with coordinates. Specifications that are precise and yet permit no movement. A place that is known and yet remains unreachable. And a duty that was continued without being able to be completely fulfilled. At the end of this case, there is no more movement. No next measure, no new file, no further letter that would change anything. What remains is a state that has learned to exist with its own standstill. Robert L. Looney is today no longer missing in the indefinite sense. His path ends at a known location. A slope in the mountains now bears the burden of this certainty. For archives and registers, this means order. For people, it means something else. It means that a search has reached its goal without delivering what one had hoped for. The duty connected with his name was not ignored. It was continued step by step, as long as it was possible. It did not end out of indifference, but at a boundary that neither patience nor technology could overcome. This distinguishes this case from many others, and yet it does not make it easier. In the Looney family, Robert does not live as a coordinate. He lives in habits that were never consciously ended, in letters that still exist, in handwriting that has not changed, in a sentence that was never meant as farewell. These things need no closure to remain. The war that triggered all this lies far back. Its maps have faded, its fronts long disappeared, but some of its consequences have not moved. They have remained where they originated, held by landscape, by decisions, by the limits of human possibilities. What this case leaves behind is no riddle and no lesson. It leaves behind a precise description of what could be achieved and of what could not be brought back. A name has received a place. A place has released no body. Sometimes the end of a story is not an event, but a quiet state. Something that does not continue, but also does not disappear. Exactly there this case remains standing. Not as an open problem, but as something that is borne by a place, by a family, and by the silent recognition that not every duty can be completely redeemed, even when one takes it seriously.